So the frontal cortex, well, the frontal lobe is motorland. It's not just motorland though. So back here, is sensory land. And deep within the lateral sulcus is the insula. So the insular lobe, which is also sensory. So you have main sensory cortices. Okay. On the postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's going to pick up on what are called general senses from your outer body tube. So your skeletal muscle on out. So you're going to have, when we looked at the skin, we saw a Pacinian corpuscle. We saw Messner's corpuscles. We saw tactile epithelial cells. We saw all that. There's also nerves wrapped around hair follicles, so hair root plexus. You have free nerve endings that sense pain receptors. They have a special name. We won't worry about it. Hot and cold receptors are free nerve endings. You have all that. And also in your muscles, you have stretch receptors. They're called proprioceptors, but don't worry about that. So these receptors pick up on all different things, including the position of a limb in space. You can close your eyes and hold your arm out and you know where it's located. That's because of proprioceptors. Pick up on stretch and tendons and muscle. All that information goes to the primary somatosensory cortex. Next door is the somatosensory association cortex. That makes sense of the information and tells you, hey, my arm's off to the left, push back a little bit. The somatosensory association cortex is involved in you being able to put your hand in your pocket and feel your keys and pick up on that's your keys. Okay. The posterior association area is here. We'll come back to that. Vision, the occipital lobe is all about vision. An enormous amount of neurons are dedicated to vision. It's the main sense we have, like 40% of neurons are related to vision. So the occipital lobe has the primary visual cortex at the tips of the lobe. Next to it is the visual association area. The auditory association area is located here on the temporal lobe. I'm sorry, the primary auditory cortex is located on the temporal lobe, kind of by the lateral sulcus, and there's the auditory association area right next door. So that's hearing. Vision, occipital lobe, hearing here by the lateral sulcus and the temporal lobe, somatosensory, parietal lobe, postcentral gyrus. Okay. Taste, that happens on the insular lobe. So down in the insula is taste, the gustatory cortex. Okay, so olfaction is complicated. We'd have to cut into your brain with a sagittal section to find where it's located. So the posterior association area receives input from all these different sensory cortices and kind of integrates it, throws it all together, and the information gets sent forward. Now, if we took a parasagittal section, not a mid-sagittal, a sagittal cut off to the side, there's part of the brain called the rhinocephalin, the nose brain, and you don't need to remember that word either. The olfactory cortex is down on the temporal lobe. It's down in the lateral sulcus. It's kind of tricky where it's located. Okay, now moving into the frontal lobe, the precentral gyrus has the primary motor cortex. So that's ultimately sending out commands for a skeletal muscle. Here. In front of it is the premotor cortex. That's where a movement is selected. So you're going to select a movement. Hey, I want to move my right arm. The premotor cortex selects the movement you're going to do, and a whole bunch of stuff happens. Ultimately, the command is sent to the primary motor cortex, and that will run down your spinal cord and initiate the contraction of the correct muscles. So premotor cortex selects a motor program. Primary motor cortex executes it. We'll look at that again. There's also a frontal eye field. I promise you I won't tag that on an exam, but it's there. The frontal eye field has to do with controlling muscles that move your eyes. Finally, there's the anterior association area, your prefrontal cortex, your prefrontal lobe. That's where all your complex cognitive thinking happens. So the anterior association area, working memory for spatial tasks, executive area for task management, object recall tasks, solving complex multitask problems. And then you have deep gray matter. That's all your like cognitive thinking and complex thinking is all in the frontal lobe. Complex integration. You have all these, like, they're called nuclei, prefrontal nuclei that are deep and do all kinds of stuff. All right, so let's ignore the bottom part here right now in entirety. Well, actually, we do need to see something. A sagittal section will reveal the corpus callosum and cross section. Looks like this. And those are tracks that link the two cerebral hemispheres. So let's go through these. We'll start off with the parietal lobe. Weird. Okay, frontal lobe last. All right, fine. So we're going to go sensory and then move to that frontal lobe. Okay, the parietal lobe has this. The primary somatosensory cortex located on the postcentral gyrus. Receive sensory information from your body, your skin, skeletal muscles, joints, tendons. Spatial discrimination precisely locates a stimulus. Okay. Now we can look at something called a somatosensory homunculus, a little man. These misrepresented proportions show the degree of innervation. What you can take away from this is that there is a heck of a lot of sensory receptors in your fingers and hands. A lot in your lips and tongue. So this weirdo right here shows the degree of innervation. Size of picture, amount of innervation. Now here's the somatosensory cortex. There's a map of general sensory receptors being sent to your brain for what's going on in those different parts of your body. Do you need to memorize that the hip is located there? Hell no. Absolutely not. All you need to know is the somatosensory cortex is there in the postcentral gyrus. Posterior to the postcentral gyrus, integrates different sensory inputs, touch, pressure, draws upon stored memories of past sensory experiences. You're able to recognize keys or coins in your pocket without looking at them. So that's the primary somatosensory cortex located in the parietal lobe. Let's go to the occipital lobe. It's all about vision. Primary visual sensory cortex on the medial part, tip of the occipital lobe, moving down into the longitudinal fissure. It's the largest of all sensory areas. So visual information that's picked up on your retina and your eye is sent to the primary primary visual cortex is what I call it. Primary visual cortex, tips of the occipital lobe. And of course you have contralateral processing or function. Right eye gets sent to the left tip, left eye gets sent to the right tip. Vision's complex though. This is only where raw data is coming in. It's first in a series of many to process visual input. The visual association area surrounds the primary visual area. It continues processing, analyzes color, form, movement, but more than that's going to have to go on. Complex visual processing is going to extend in your temporal and parietal lobes. So visions are dominant sense. Primary visual cortex picks up raw data. The association area starts to analyze the visual data. And then what all goes on with vision is darn complex. Visual processing moves all over the place. Okay. So there we go. Raw data, visual association area, analyze form, color, those sort of things. And then it gets sent up here. There's processing. Here there's processing. It's all over the place. Okay, temporal lobe. What's going on there? Primary auditory cortex. Function, conscious awareness of sound. Sound waves excite receptors in your inner ear. The impulses are transmitted to your primary auditory cortex. Location, superior edge of the temporal lobe. I'll show you where it's located. The auditory association area, it's posterior to the primary auditory cortex. So here's a primary auditory cortex. Auditory association area is behind it. Okay, evaluates different sounds. This is a typo. Basically, the auditory association area is going to process raw sound data going to the primary auditory cortex. Now, behind the auditory cortex and all that is the posterior association area. So this is receiving input from multiple places. Integrates, and the information gets sent to your prefrontal cortex. All right, within the posterior association area is an area called vernix area. Vernix area is basically so you can understand and recognize speech. That's vernix area. Vernix area, you can comprehend what's being said. If vernix area is damaged, you might hear everything, but you don't comprehend anything in any language. So that's temporal lobe. Okay. Primary olfactory sensory cortex. Let's clean this off. Okay. It's located right here. So if we move into the lateral sulcus, what's color-coded orange here is the insula, the insular lobe. The olfactory cortex, though, is on a bulge on the superior part of the temporal lobe inside the lateral sulcus. It's a region called the uncus, but you don't need to remember that. Here it is. The primary olfactory cortex. So, conscious awareness, sense of smell. Basically, you have the olfactory nerve is dangling its dendrites through the cribriform foramina on the cribriform plates on the ethmoid bone. That's dropping down into your nasal cavity like roots from a tree into a cave. That's picked up by something called the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, goes straight back and links to this olfactory cortex. So sensory input from your nose goes through the olfactory bulb, olfactory tracts to the olfactory cortex. The olfactory cortex is tied into something else, though. Your olfaction is connected to something called the limbic system. The limbic system, which we'll talk about shortly, the limbic system is your emotional brain. Involved in emotions and also memory. Smell is tied into your emotional brain, which is also your emotional brain is involved with memory. So really your olfactory sensory cortex, it's not going to recall smells. Conscious awareness of the sense of smell, but it's connected to the limbic system. Have you ever smelled something and it makes you want to puke? I have. The smell of carrion makes me uncontrollably vomit. I can't handle it or start to vomit. I have to get away from it. Certain smells elicit emotions and even strong sensations from those emotions, such as retching. I'm sure you may have experienced something like that in your life. Or the smell makes you sick right away. That's because smell is directly connected to this limbic system, your emotional brain. Okay, so here's the insula. It's lit up. You see it right there, it's orange. Unfortunately, at no point do I have anything to tag the insula and ask you what it is. In lab, I would. The insula has 3 different cortices on it. Taste. So gustation, taste, is sent straight to the insula. That's where you're picking up on taste.
I have a question on the test. Do you want us to put gustation or taste?
I would put gustation. I'm not sure gustation's listed on the test anywhere, but if you see the word gustation, that means taste. After chapter 16, gustation will be firmly implanted. Okay, your balance, equilibrium. Equilibrium, sensory cortex is on the insula. So 3 different things feed into the insula. Equilibrium. Equilibrium is one of the special senses, and it's located in your inner ear, right next to hearing, right next door. Gustation is sent to the insula, and the visceral sensory cortex is on the insula. So you have the somatosensory cortex is for your outer body tube. But your inner body tube, what's going on in your organs, all your viscera, that is sent to the insula. General sensory input from thoracic and abdominal organs. Hunger, pain, pressure, anything going on with your viscera, that's heading off to the visceral sensory cortex on the insula. So the insula picks up on equilibrium, gustation, and general visceral sensory. Your outer body tube, primary somatosensory. So this is for your outer body tube. Okay, now let's look at the frontal lobe. Right off the bat, the precentral gyrus has the primary motor cortex. It's somatic, so your outer body tube. Your skeletal muscle is what it controls. So toes, ankle, knee, hip, trunk. Again, the degree of innervation has to do with, well, the weird little guy shows how much innervation's happening. Way back when we talked about motor units, the motor unit consists of neurons innervating muscle and how different skeletal muscle fibers in the muscle are innervated by different neurons. There's an obscene amount of motor units for muscles in your hands, your tongue, your lips, things like that. So when it says throat swallowing, that's going to be infrahyoid and hyoid muscles. Tongue, extrinsic muscles of the tongue, your tongue itself. Jaw, masseter, temporalis, things like that. Face, all those facial muscles, orbicularis oculi. Neck, fingers, hand, we didn't look at any of those muscles. Wrist, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi radialis. Elbow, shoulder, deltoid, all that, so forth. Do you need to memorize this map? Absolutely not. Okay, the premotor cortex is anterior to the precentral gyrus. The premotor cortex receives processed sensory information. So visual, auditory, general somatic sensation, all that would have been actually integrated in your anterior association area, and the decision is sent to the premotor cortex. So sensory feedback, it's going to control voluntary action. So your premotor cortex is going to plan a movement. It's going to select a program. That information is then sent to this primary motor cortex and the movement is executed. Broca's area is located right here. Broca's area is on the left cerebral hemisphere. Broca's area is responsible for generating speech. There's a similar region in the right cerebral hemisphere, which gives emotional overtones to your speech. So Broca's area, special motor speech area, connected to language comprehension areas and posterior association area. In other words, Wernicke's area is linked to Broca's. Okay. So speech production, Broca's area in the left cerebral hemisphere, that's for you to be able to talk. If you want to not talk like a robot or an iPhone, early iPhone, the right side has to not be damaged. The right side gives emotion, so you're not a robot. Right side's damaged, you're going to talk like a robot. In some people, it's switched though. The right side is Broca's, and the left side is not talking like a robot. Frontal eye field, voluntary eye movements, like when your eyes are following a moving target. It's off in the frontal lobe. Okay, so that should be it for the major like cortices and motor regions. Now we have the multimodal association areas. So we have the posterior association area, sensory. Anterior, complex is all hell. Complex is all get out. Complex. Thinking, memory, emotions. The limbic system is linked and gonna throw some emotion into that. Memory, all that. Okay, so large areas of cerebral cortex. The sensory area, sensory association area, makes associations between kinds of sensory information. Okay, posterior association area, located at the interface of visual, auditory, somatosensory, integrates all your sensory information into a unified perception. Gives you a body sense and language comprehension and speech, because the vernix area is tied into it. There it is, vernix area, speech comprehension, coordination of auditory and visual aspects of language, recognition of sound, initiation of word articulation. Broca's area can be fine. You can talk just great and have emotion, but a vernix area, you can't understand anything if it's damaged. Okay. Anterior association area, the prefrontal cortex, it's kind of who you are. Receives info from your posterior association area. So that's going to feed forward. Integrates information with past experience, linked to the limbic system, so emotion. Initiates and plans motor movement, so much, much more. It's kind of the last area of your brain to develop. More complex functions to the anterior association area, all aspects of thinking, perceiving, intentionally remembering, processing abstract ideas, impulse control, mental flexibility, social skills, humor, empathy, conscious, basically who you are, your personality. All right here. It's the last area to develop. As you're getting older, going from teenager and adult, last area to develop. Okay, judgment and impulse control. Teenagers don't have it. Jump in a car, drive like an idiot, 90 miles an hour down the road, because they lack judgment and impulse control. They haven't developed it all the way yet. Judgment, impulse control, not fully developed. In adolescence. Should get rid of that. Limbic association area. Let's just say it's your limbic system. Forget calling association area, it just gets confusing. Limbic system. It's not even worry where it is, it's just down in your cerebrum. So your limbic system is your emotional brain, and it's involved with memory. Memory storage is complex all over your brain. The The limbic system is involved in retrieving memories and forming memories. So the limbic system aids in memory formation and also processes emotions. So it's your emotional brain. So your limbic system is a functional system. We have two functional systems in your cerebral hemispheres. Just all different parts of your cerebral hemispheres or parts of your brain linked together. So the limbic system, it's your emotional or affective feelings brain. It supports long-term memory formation. The hypothalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, is at the center of the limbic system. So the limbic system's kind of all over the place. Here's the diencephalon. The hypothalamus is down here. It's in the limbic system. So we have a couple major features of the limbic system. The cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. The parahippocampal gyrus, ignore it. Okay, so the cingulate gyrus is linked all over the place. This mediates your emotional response to stimuli. It works with the hypothalamus for behavioral responses and emotions and controls your autonomic nervous system. Okay, the hippocampus is involved in long-term memory formation. The amygdala, amygdaloid body, elicits your fear response. The amygdala is involved in formation of fear-based memories. So that's sort of your fear center. Hippocampus involved in helping form memories. The cingulate gyrus just kind of mediates processing emotional response to stimuli. And it's linked to all your cortical regions. Now there's something called the fornix. This is like the corpus callosum, the fornix. The fornix links the limbic system regions. The hypothalamus at the center of the limbic system. Pleasure, rage, fear, sex drive, and sexual behavior. Hypothalamus involved in that. So this is your limbic system, your emotional brain. Okay, we know that the cerebral hemispheres, it's contralateral processing. Right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of your body and vice versa. But you also have a lateralization of complex thought. Meaning one cerebral hemisphere is better than another. But you already know that, like right brain, left brain kind of people, kind of junk they talk about. So the hemispheres are specialized for different cognitive functions. Your left cerebral hemisphere, control over language, math, and logic. Right cerebral hemisphere specializes in visual spatial skills, reading facial expressions, artistic, musical, intuition, emotion. So that's usually the way it is. So in the prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe, the right is usually involved in these, and the left is your math, logical side, language ability. In some people, it's reversed though. Some people, everything's switched. Okay. Now there is cerebral white matter, which is deep to the cerebral cortex. These are myelinated axons linking all the different cortexes in the two hemispheres. Additionally, there's myelinated axons running up from your spinal cord, running in to your cortex, running up to your cerebrum. So cerebral white matter, all tracks myelinated axons. So there's communication between cerebral cortices, association areas, and between your cerebral cortex and your spinal cord. So there's three kinds of fibers: association, Association fibers, you see them. Associate areas of the same cerebral hemisphere. And then there's these that run forward, involved with vision and all the senses. Okay, commissural run between the hemispheres. The corpus callosum, major commissural fibers linking the two hemispheres. Finally, there's projection fibers. They're going to run from your cerebral cortex down your spinal cord or your spinal cord up to your cerebral cortex. So here you see red projection fibers. All right. You know all these fibers are here. All you have to know is what the difference is between association, commissural, and projection fibers. About the only structure you'll ever see on a lab practical is the corpus callosum in a cross section. That's it. The fornix is also commissural fiber, but the fornix links the different parts of the limbic system. Limbic means band, like a headband, because where the limbic system is located in your cerebrum, it's like a band in your cerebrum, like a headband, but deep, like a circle. Finally, we'll look at some deep gray matter. You have deep forebrain, like frontal lobe, prefrontal nuclei. We're not going to look at those. There's not even a picture in your book of what they actually look like and where they are. It just talks about what they do. That's just cognitive, complex thought. We'll ignore them. There are basal nuclei, though, that are located kind of outside the limbic system, but deep to the ventricles. And you see them right here, the basal nuclei, located right there on one side. The basal nuclei. There's just 3 different ones on each side. The basal nuclei traditionally are called the basal ganglia. If you look them up online, they're always going to pop up as the basal ganglia. But recall a ganglion refers to neuronal cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So we'll call them basal nuclei because they're in the CNS. There's 3 structures, and we'll look at them. The caudate nucleus is here, tucked on the medial aspect of the lateral ventricle. That's the caudate nucleus. It connects to here is the putamen. Sounds like a Russian president, Vladimir Putin. The putamen nucleus. Deep to the putamen is the globus pallidus. Here they are in cross section. Here we see them. The caudate nucleus, the putamen nucleus, and then the globus pallidus is deep. Here's the globus pallidus is immediately deep to the putamen nucleus. In the cross section, you see the head of the caudate, you see the putamen, and the globus pallidus is deep. So this is deep gray matter. The basal ganglia is what they're called, but we're calling them basal nuclei. So here you see them. They are the real deal. Okay, here's the thalamus in here, diencephalon. So these are the basal nuclei. Why do we care? They're key in movement. The basal nuclei, your primary motor cortex doesn't do jack diddly squat for movement until the basal nuclei tell it to. could think of them as complex calculators. They cooperate with your premotor cortex in controlling your movement. So the basal nuclei, that's what they do. And there's something else that works along with them, we'll see shortly, that's in the midbrain called the substantia nigra that is involved in movement as well. So what do they do, the basal nuclei? Well, we're not going to belabor that two of them are called the striatum because they have like melanin in them, the striated appearance. It's the caudate and the putamen. The globus pallidus is something else. What do? They start, stop, and regulate the intensity of voluntary movements. Here's what they do. So the basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus and putamen nucleus, when a movement's selected, send out stimuli for contraction of muscles required for a movement. The globus pallidus is going to send out instructions to inhibit other muscles from moving. You don't have to remember which of these does which. Just know the names of the basal nuclei and know that they're involved in selecting the correct muscle for a movement and inhibiting the wrong muscles. So they're involved in that. So they start, stop, regulate intensity of voluntary movements. They have one friend that's in on the game with them, and we'll see them when we look at the midbrain. The substantia nigra in the midbrain acts with the basal nuclei for motor control. Parkinson's disease, the substantia nigra is deteriorating, and you end up like Michael J. Fox. Okay, so let's look at this stuff that we've looked at so far. Okay, so here we go. Central sulcus, right there. You see the central sulcus, lit up in green. Okay, lateral sulcus, lit up in green. Temporal lobe, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. Which primary sensory cortex would you find at the tips of the occipital lobe?
Visual?
Yeah, primary visual cortex. So that would be in the occipital lobe. Temporal lobe.
Auditory?
Yeah, auditory, exactly. Okay, so there's your lateral sulcus right there. Okay. Central sulcus. There and there. Okay, now I just selected the postcentral gyrus. Let's select both of them. Okay. Oh, oops. Postcentral gyrus. Which cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus? What cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus?
It's the sensory cortex, right?
Yeah, primary somatosensory.
Somatosensory.
Yeah, the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. Here's the prefrontal gyrus. Prefrontal gyri. Which cortex is located there?
The motor.
Yeah, primary motor cortex. Okay, premotor cortex would be anterior, right there. Okay, let's look at these basal ganglia. Well, we could look at the limbic system at the same time. Bam. Okay. All right, well, that right there is the putamen nucleus. That's the caudate nucleus. Okay. Okay, so here's the basal nuclei. It's calling them basal ganglia because most of the time they do. So this is the caudate nucleus. That's the putamen. These we'll ignore. These are other ones I'm not covering. Okay, that's the substantia nigra, but that's in the midbrain. It works with this. This should be the subthalamic nucleus. Forget that. So the substantia nigra is not in your cerebrum. It's down in your midbrain. Okay. This is the globus pallidus. It has a lateral and medial segment, but we don't care. It's just the globus pallidus is deep to the putamen. So the putamen, the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, and the substantia nigra located down in the midbrain, in the brainstem, what these do is, when the premotor cortex sends out a motor plan, it gets sent to the basal nuclei first. Then they select which muscles should contract and which muscles should not. And that's all sent to the primary motor cortex. Okay, so putamen, caudate nucleus, globus pallidus is deep, substantia nigra is in your midbrain. Right, let's look at the limbic system. I'll show you that. Okay, there's a lateral ventricle. We'll get rid of the ventricles. Let's get rid of the basal nuclei. Okay, so here's the parts of the limbic system we looked at. This is your emotional brain involved in retrieving memories, things like that. This here is the cingulate gyrus, choroid plexus, a lateral ventricle. That certainly doesn't look right. That is screwed up. That should be the cingulate gyrus. Okay, we'll get rid of it. Okay, here's the hippocampus right there. Hippocampus and the amygdala, the amygdaloid body. So let's see what it does here. The amygdaloid body, or amygdala, is a nucleus located deep, blah, blah, blah. It forms part of the limbic system, has a major role in the processing and consolidation of the memory of emotional stimuli, fear. Hippocampus, important role in the screening and formation of new memories. Also plays a role in navigation and finding new routes, so memory formation. So amygdala, generating fear-based memory and recalling it. Hippocampus, memory formation, your emotional brain. So that's it. We'll have to look at visible body to see the rest. This right here should be the corpus callosum. And a sagittal section is just flat. You always see the corpus callosum. Like that. Corpus callosum, sagittal section. Okay, here's your olfactory bulb for smell, olfactory tracts. It's going to head back to the olfactory cortex. Let's get rid of the hippocampus. Let's get rid of the amygdala. Okay, now what we're seeing here is the, let's get rid of that junk. So what we're going to look at next is your your diencephalon. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, which is all this structure right here. The thalamus is the kind of like the AT&T operator. It's the gateway to the cerebrum. So everything moving up from the spinal cord through the midbrain, through the brainstem, has to relay in the thalamus. So neurons synapse here, and then different neurons relay the information up to the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is the gatekeeper. It's the relay station. It's the major structure of the diencephalon. The hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. There it is. That's the hypothalamus, anterior and front. The hypothalamus does a lot of different stuff. It's part of the limbic system. It's involved in sex behavior. It's involved in rage, fear, all kinds of stuff. And it makes hormones, which it sends through a stalk called the infundibulum to your pituitary gland, which is right here. Pituitary gland sends out hormones. Infundibulum, hypothalamus. Now on the roof of the thalamus, here back here is the pineal gland. This is the epithalamus. Well, we can't see it. The epithalamus is in the back. And there's the pineal gland secretes melatonin, day-night cycles. It's controlled by the hypothalamus, exerts control on the pineal gland. Huh. Is it broken? Oh, there we go. Yeah, diencephalon. Thalamus, pineal gland and epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. Okay, next. This is funky. Get rid of the hypothalamus. Okay. Next, we have your brain stem. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata below. All right, so we're going to take a look at the diencephalon and then move on down through the brain stem and then take a look at the spinal cord, and then we're done. So the diencephalon, you can see where it's located, sandwiched by the cerebral hemispheres here. See it? Okay. So it consists of largely the thalamus. The thalamus is the relay station. Relay station for information coming up from the spinal cord is going to synapse in the thalamus, and then the information goes up to the cerebral cortex. So that's it. It's the gateway to the cerebrum. Now, if we look at, this is a anterior view. Okay. Mid-sagittal section, you see the hypothalamus below the thalamus. The hypothalamus has a lot of different functions, and it's also part of the limbic system. If we look at a superior view here, you see the epithalamus is on top of the thalamus. And then there's the pineal gland out back. Pineal gland secretes melatonin. Hypothalamus controls secretion of melatonin. Hypothalamus, besides it has a lot of different functions, dropping down from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, part of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus makes some hormones, the master regulatory hormones that kind of control the entire endocrine system, most of it, but not all of it. So that's the diencephalon. So core of the forebrain surrounded by the cerebrum. Okay. Now one thing, the thalamus, these two egg-shaped objects, the thalamus is made up of about 12 nuclei. We don't need to learn the names of the 12 nuclei. There's just 2 nuclei we'll look at for a second. The thalamus sandwiches the third ventricle. You see the third ventricle right here? The third ventricle, why it's so thin and looks like a chicken head, is because the thalamus is stuck on either side of it. The thalamus connects the 2 thalami connect to one another via the interthalamic adhesion. They connect right through the third ventricle. I'll show you where that's located. Okay, thalamus, 2 egg-shaped nuclei make up blah, blah, blah. Gateway of the cerebrum. Sorts, edits, relays messages coming to or from the cerebral cortex. The epithalamus has a pineal gland, secretes melatonin. It's under control of the hypothalamus. Controls your sleep-wake cycles. Hypothalamus is your main visceral control center. And by the way, your viscera, your organs, you don't control that. You don't think about it. That's under the control of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. In your autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus is the boss of the ANS. So the hypothalamus is the boss of your involuntary nervous system. The hypothalamus is also part of the limbic system, controls emotional responses, controls most of the endocrine system via the pituitary gland, okay, secretions. Infundibulum is the stalk. That's just this little stalk right here. Connects the pituitary. Okay, the boss of the ANS, autonomic regulation of your body temperature, hunger and thirst, sleep-wake cycles, and all your viscera. So ANS control of this, ANS control of your viscera. Okay. The limbic part is involved in memory formation. Okay. There's these mammillary bodies. These are some nuclei involved in a memory formation. They receive input from the hippocampus. The mammillary bodies can be seen right here. So the thalamus, each thalamus made up of about 12 nuclei. Each hypothalamus, the hypothalamus is made up of about 12 nuclei. The mammillary bodies is one such nuclei in the hypothalamus. Here's the thalamus, the 12 nuclei. We're not going to worry about which one's which and what it does. The only ones we'll look at is in black. The medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. The lateral geniculate bodies, vision, links to the lateral geniculate body, and they get sent to the primary visual cortex. So Here's your eyes out here. Optic nerve, synapses, there in the thalamus, in the lateral geniculate body, and then a neuron goes to the primary visual cortex. The medial geniculate body has to do with hearing. There's your ear, your inner ear, you have a nerve, synapses with the medial geniculate body. And then heads off to your auditory cortex. Okay, now the hypothalamus, there's a bunch of nuclei in black. We're not going to look at these. These are involved in day-night cycles. The mammillary bodies bulge, they stick out. You can see them there. They're involved in memory formation. It's like a relay station for memory, receives inputs for the hippocampus, mammillary bodies. So that's what's going on with your thalamus and hypothalamus. This is the gateway. Pituitary gland is an endocrine system organ, but you see how the nervous system and the endocrine system are linked. Okay, your brain stem. Up here is the diencephalon. We have the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata. That's not part of your brain stem. That's just all through it. Okay. So the brain stem, the pattern it has is outer white matter and inner gray matter, but additional gray matter compared to the spinal cord. Now in the midbrain, it has some important structures. On the back of it, we have 4 bulges called the corpora. Quadrigemina, which consists of 2 pairs of superior colliculi for plural. Well, not 2 pairs, 1 pair. The single one of them is a superior colliculus. And then there are the inferior colliculi. So those would be here. One of them is an inferior colliculus. These are involved in visual reflexes. And these are for auditory reflexes. Within the midbrain, there's the substantia nigra. We know that that works with the basal nuclei for movement. There's also the red nucleus. Minor role in movement, just in limb flexion. That's it. Okay, the pons is just a bridge. And that's literally what its name means, the pons. The medulla oblongata is the superior continuation of the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata has a lot of important things going on with it. Now, do you need to memorize all this junk in these? No. The only thing you would want to know is about the substantia nigra and the red nucleus, and that's it. And the corpora quadrigemina on the back of the brainstem. All we can say about the medulla, we're going to say in the next slide or two, what's located there. Now you do have cranial nerves. These are nerves that come out of your brain. 12 pairs. The nuclei of the cranial nerves are located, 10 of them, well, 11 of them, nope, 9 of them are located in the brainstem. So that's what all this is, cranial nerve nuclei, things like that. Now there's this gray matter that runs entirely through the brainstem called the reticular formation, here, here, and here. And we'll look at that for 1 second in a second. So this is your brain stem. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. The corpora quadrigemina, superior and inferior colliculi, involved in visual and auditory reflexes. Substantia nigra works with the basal nuclei in movement. Red nucleus, flexion of limbs. Cranial nerve nuclei located in the different parts of the brainstem. Okay, the midbrain. Oh yeah, the cerebral aqueduct runs through the midbrain. Okay, corpora quadrigemina, two paired projections at the posterior surface of brainstem. Superior colliculi, visual reflexes. Inferior, auditory. If you're talking about a single one of them, it's a colliculus. Cerebral peduncles, who cares? It's just bulges in the front that hold up the cerebrum. Substantia nigra works with basal nuclei to control movement. Red nucleus regulates limb flexion, minor role in movement. Pons, bulging region between the midbrain and medulla. It does have an important function. It's involved in regulating breathing. Medulla is where all the good stuff is. Continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum, you have some autonomic reflex centers. What's in the medulla oblongata? Your cardiovascular center. Heart rate and blood pressure is in the medulla, controlled by the medulla. Your respiratory center, breathing rate, and depth. Now the pons has a respiratory center also. The pontine respiratory group, and that works with the medulla. Vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, it's all in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla has some key features. Okay, what's the reticular formations? Moving all through the brain stem is the reticular formations. There's something called the RAS, reticular activating system. Basically, neurons, axons, fly up from your spinal cord, ascending general sensory tracts, touch, pain, temperature, fly up through the reticular formation, visual impulses, synapse in the thalamus, and then there's all these radiating projections. Go to your cerebral cortex. What this does is you get a repeated stimulus, basically to keep you alert and awake. Sensory information is being sent from all over your body via the RAS, reticular activating system, being sent to your cerebral cortex. So that maintains consciousness and alertness, the RAS. Info can be sent down from it when you're going to sleep. People that have narcolepsy, they just drop asleep. Their RAS is malfunctioning. The RAS also allows you habituation. You can remain, you can ignore repetitive stimuli, but be sensitive to non-repetitive. Here it is again. So ascending general sensory tracts, touch, pain, temperature, auditory impulses, visual impulses. So sensory tracts synapse on reticular activating system neurons, brainstem. They relay sensory information in your cerebrum via the thalamus, and there's a continuous stream of sensory stimuli to keep you aroused and alert. On the other hand, descending projections help you sleep. So that's the RAS. Finally, the last of the brain, the cerebellum. So here we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. You have these cerebellar peduncles, just connections that come out the back right here. Coming out of the midbrain, coming out of the pons, and coming out of the medulla oblongata, just connect to the cerebellum. Your cerebellum has the same setup as your cerebrum. Outer gray matter, inner white matter. Same setup. So you have the cerebellar cortex. You have a big anterior lobe, a huge posterior lobe, and a little tiny flocculonodular lobe. Okay, we're not going to call the ridges gyri. We're going to call them folia. And they're still sulci. You have two cerebellar hemispheres with anterior and posterior lobes, just like your cerebrum has two hemispheres. They're not connected by the corpus callosum. They're connected by something called the vermis. That's the equivalent of the corpus callosum. Gray matter cortex, the internal white matter, is called the arbor vitae, the tree of life. What's the cerebellum do? It's involved in coordination, and it stores memories of motor commands. Just like riding a bike, that information is stored in your cerebellum. So your cerebellum works in the movement game, motor control. The cerebellum fine-tunes and coordinates skeletal muscle movements, and it helps you with posture and equilibrium. It's involved in balance. Basically, the cerebellum adjusts any movements you're doing. If you're moving wrong for what's the intended program is, the cerebellum's going to send information to your cerebrum to adjust it. Birds have massive cerebellums because of flight. So, cerebellum, coordinate body movements. Cerebellar cortex receives three types of information: equilibrium info, info on your current movements of limbs, neck, and trunk, and info from your cerebral cortex. It's going to process that info and adjust any movements you're doing if needed. So, coordinated movement. Cerebellum receives info on movement from the motor cortex. Cerebellum compares intended movement with where you're actually, what your body position actually is. Sends instructions back continuously to fine-tune and adjust motor commands. Okay, higher cognitive functions, learning a new motor skill, remembering one. All right, so let's look at the cerebellum. Then we'll look at the spinal cord. We're over it. So that's it. We're almost done. Hang in there. So let's look at this stuff. What we looked at as far as models go. Okay. Cerebellum. Okay. Should have the anterior lobe, posterior lobe of the cerebellum. Should be the flocculonodular lobe right there. Okay, left. Okay, there it is. Anterior, posterior, flocculonodular. So let's hide this. Okay. Now you can see the arbor vitae right here. This is the tree of life. This is the internal white matter of the cerebellum. Arbor vitae. the cerebellum connects to the midbrain. Okay, there's a middle cerebellar peduncle and connects to the medulla oblongata. Okay. So here's the vermis right there. That connects the two hemispheres. So the cerebellum overall, in humans, it's divided. So there's the vermis. All right, let's look at this real quick. Here's the corpora quadrigemina. Right here, superior colliculus. You have two of them, superior colliculi. So what do the superior colliculi do again? What do these do? Some kind of reflexes. What kind? They're involved in what reflexes?
Would it be with movement of the eyes?
No, that would be in your that's the frontal eye field. Now it's in the frontal lobe. But they could be involved in movement eye. How about you make that more general? Visual reflexes. End of story.
Okay.
The end. Okay, inferior colliculus right there. Inferior colliculus here. You have two inferior colliculi. What reflex? Auditory. Involved with auditory pathways, including reflex responses to loud noise. Okay. Visual light reflexes, like the pupillary light reflex. Pupils constrict when bright light hits your retina. So this is the corpora quadrigemina, the four of them together. Two superior colliculi, two inferior colliculi. These are attachment points right here for the cerebellum. Okay. Okay. Here you see, what's this white stuff in the cerebellum right here? All this white stuff, what is that called? Arbor vitae. Okay. Superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Pituitary gland, it's going to give all this ridiculous names to it here. There's a mammillary body. Mammillary body involved in memory formation. It's in the hypothalamus, part of the limbic system. Okay. Okay, now we have the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Okay, let's wrap this up because I'm killing you. Okay, your spinal cord. Okay, foramen magnum. Your spinal cord terminates at L1 or L2 vertebrae. That's it. Your spinal cord does not go all the way through your lumbar vertebrae and into your sacrum. That's just the way it is. So spinal cord terminates at L1 or L2. The very end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. That's the inferior region of the spinal cord. The spinal cord from the conus medullaris, there's a bunch of nerves coming out of your spinal cord running through the sacrum and coming out the ventral and dorsal sacral foramina. That is called the cauda equina, the horse's tail. So at the bottom of your spinal cord, you have the conus medullaris. And you have the cauda equina. It's like a great big ponytail. That's the horse's tail. Right. So we know the spinal cord that probably axons are coming down from your brain running through the spinal cord, and probably axons are heading up the spinal cord. So clearly it's two-way communication. Also, you have reflexes like the knee-jerk reaction, spinal reflexes, major reflex center. The spinal cord has the meninges. It just lacks the periosteal dura mater. There is no periosteal dura mater. There's just the meningeal dura mater. So we have the meninges are continuous with the brain. They run down. Now, at the very bottom of the spinal cord, we have the filum terminale. It's colored green here, coming from the conus medullaris. Coming from the conus medullaris is this green structure called the filum terminale that anchors the spinal cord in place on the coccyx. It's an extension of the meninges. Laterally, they're extensions of the meninges. Lateral extensions of the pia mater form something called the denticulate ligament. That anchors the spinal cord laterally in the vertebral canal. So we need to have the spinal cord not banging around. So the spinal cord is anchored laterally via the denticulate ligament and inferiorly by the filum terminale. So it's held in place. So that's the deal with the spinal cord. Now you have two major enlargements. One is the lumbar enlargement, and the other is the cervical enlargement. Why do you think you have an enlargement of the spinal cord in the cervical region, and why do you have one in the lumbar a lumbar enlargement?
What it do to the movement? So like movement of your neck and then the way you like move your body.
Well, your you're warmish. Any other ideas why you have an enlargement in the cervical and lumbar regions?
Is it because they have to extend to your limbs? Like it's
Yes, there's a hell of a lot of nerves going to your limbs. There's enlargement because there's a lot of neuron cell bodies in the spinal cord coming out. So the thing is you do have what are called sacral spinal nerves. It's just their bodies are not in the sacrum. Their bodies are way the hell up here, but all the nerves are coming down and exiting out the foramina. Remember your vertebrae, that not the vertebral foramina was where the spinal cord moves through. We had transverse foramina in the cervical vertebrae. But remember, when two vertebrae articulated with one another, laterally we had intervertebral foramina. What's coming out of those are spinal nerves. So you have spinal nerves coming out through the vertebrae the whole way down. There's just a lot of them in the cervical region. And you have lumbar sacral bodies in the spinal cord, but the nerves run all the way down. So let's take a side view. Cross section of the spinal cord and vertebrae, cervical region. Okay. What this shows you is that the meninges are continuous. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, the delicate mother. Well, there is no periosteal dura mater. Instead, you have fat. So you have fat surrounding the spinal cord in the vertebral column. That's the epidural space. Ever hear of someone getting an epidural? Yeah. So I presume that's an injection into the epidural space. Now, if you get a spinal tap, there's sampling cerebral spinal fluid in the subarachnoid space. So this is the pattern. Epidural space has fat, no periosteal dura mater. Spinal nerves head out, intervertebral foramina. How two vertebrae articulate on the side, it makes a foramen, and spinal nerves come out. Right here, what you can see this right here, arachnoid mater. It may not be it, but the denticulate ligament comes out on the sides like that and anchors. So here's how the spinal nerves come out. Here we go. The spinal nerves are numbered just like the vertebrae, which is irritating, but that's the way it's done. We have C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. Same numbering as the vertebrae, but do you notice anything weird? How many cervical vertebrae did you have? 7. How many spinal nerves do you have in the cervical region? 8. That's because C1 comes out on top of the atlas. The pattern after that, spinal nerves exit. So if we move down so it's weird in your neck region, but you have 8 cervical spinal nerves. C1 heads out the top of the atlas. C2 heads out underneath the atlas. This is C1, C2, C3, etc. Finally, below C7, we have C8. Now, when we get to the thoracic vertebrae, now we have the overall pattern. The spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramina underneath the vertebrae of the same number. Spinal nerve T1 comes out T1 underneath. Spinal nerve T2 comes out vertebrae T2 underneath. Basically, you have this many spinal nerves, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. Spelled wrong. We'll see you later. Okay. So here you see down here, the sacral spinal nerves, S1 through 5, their bodies are all the way up here, but then the cauda equina extends down and they're coming out sacral foramina. So that's the setup of nerves leaving the spinal cord. Internal anatomy of spinal cord. Internal gray matter, outer whiter matter. Basically, there's a butterfly. There is a beautiful butterfly, as Vince Vaughn would say, inside your spinal cord. The butterfly is connected by the gray commissure. That's just the crossbar of the H. And we know we have a central canal. Hollow, you have a hollow nerve cord. Cerebral spinal fluid flowing through it. Okay, so there's some anatomy of the spinal cord. We have the ventral median fissure, this slice here, and the dorsal median sulcus. You have funiculi, dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, and ventral funiculus. That's just the white matter. Where things get cool is the gray matter. That's where anything's remotely interesting. So it works like this. So here's the gray matter of the spinal cord. Central canal. This is the gray commissure right here. Who cares? This is the good stuff. This is the dorsal horn. This is the ventral horn. And in some parts of the spinal cord in the gray matter, the thoracic region, you have an additional horn right here. What do you want to call that one? What do you want to call this horn right here? The devil's horn? Lateral horn. Dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn. So we have different cell bodies are located there. It's like this. Located in the ventral horn are somatic motor neuron cell bodies. So SM, motor neuron bodies. Located in the lateral horn in the thoracic region, we have visceral motor cell bodies. Located in the dorsal horn, we have somatic sensory interneuron bodies. And visceral sensory interneuron bodies. So that's what's going on in your spinal cord. What cell bodies are where. So this is the deal. What makes up a spinal nerve, we'll see next lecture. Basically, you have feeding into the spinal cord dorsal roots and ventral roots. The two roots come together and form the spinal nerve. So your spinal nerves have sensory neurons and motor neurons in them. They split off those, they approach the cord. There's always this bulge called a dorsal root ganglion. And in there, you'll find the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Recall, sensory neurons are always unipolar. Okay, so here we have incoming blue, SS, incoming green, VS, located in the ventral horn, SM, motor neuron bodies, located in the lateral horn, visceral motor, autonomic nervous system. So sensory is in the dorsal horn, ventral horn is motor, and lateral. So this page, you want to dial this in. This is for sure something that I like. So you want to dial this one in. Okay. So I know you're dying in a couple more minutes and we're out. Let's look at the big picture, and it's a big picture. Let me show you how some of these different brain structures control movement. We're going to look at what's going on with the premotor cortex. So what we're looking at here is the premotor cortex, the primary motor cortex, the basal nuclei, the thalamus, and the cerebellum, and then what's happening down the spinal cord. Number one, upper motor neurons in the premotor cortex select a motor program. So the motor program's selected. So there's a neuron body in your premotor cortex. That information is relayed to the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are going to send out the commands to the primary motor cortex, which muscles need to contract and which muscles need to be inhibited. So that's what the basal nuclei are going to do. So the premotor cortex sent the message to the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei said, fine, these muscles are going to move, these ones are not. That information gets sent to the thalamus because it's the relay station. So the basal nuclei send the message to the thalamus. The thalamus relays the commands of the basal nuclei to the primary motor cortex. Now the primary motor cortex, a neuron from it, sends out the commands, bam, down the spinal cord to a section of the spinal cord responsible for controlling those muscles. So the command came from the motor cortex down the spinal cord. That would have came down and synapsed in the somatic motor region and sent out the motor command. So there we go. Upper motor neurons stimulate lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord stimulate a skeletal muscle to contract. So there we go. We start to have flexion, biceps brachii is contracting. At the same time, there are sensors in biceps brachii, in the short head here and its tendon. Sensory neuron is going to detect stretch in biceps brachii and position. What's biceps brachii doing? That information is going to relay back to the spinal cord. It's going to come in the back here to an interneuron, and then that information gets sent up to none other than the cerebellum. Sensory information is relayed to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum says, that movement's weird. You better fix it. So the cerebellum sends instructions to modify the movement as needed. So the cerebellum is then going to synapse in the thalamus, and that information sent to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then relayed to the primary motor cortex to adjust movement as needed. So that's how everything's working together right there, as far as movement goes. I know you're fried. If you look at it later, it'll be better. Okay, the very end. Meningitis, infection of the meninges. You're dead. Christina, you ever deal with anyone with meningitis in the hospital?
Yeah, always.
Yeah. How many of them make it?
Most of them actually do. They're usually on contact isolation. They're usually kind of maybe similar to like stroke patients where like, you know, they're obtunded and they don't respond, or they're, you know, or, you know, their neural is obviously is not intact. And usually it's just with antibiotics. Some of them do make it. Not a lot has fully recovered. Some of them will have like deficits, and then sometimes a lot of them will end up being like kind of like, you know, like a kind of like a vegetable. You know, they just don't really move around and stuff. So it just really depends.
Yeah. So if they're being given antibiotics, then that would be like bacterial meningitis. That's more typical, or?
Yeah, but still, even with viral too, there are antiviral medications that you can give.
Yeah.
And medications that you can give for inflammation as well to kind of help minimize the effects. But, you know, during the active process, obviously, they, you know, like as they improve, their neural deficits will improve as well.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, another disorder, hydrocephalus, cerebral spinal fluid accumulation. Water on the brain. What are you going to do? Drain the ventricles. Okay. Disorders, Parkinson's disease, degeneration of the substantia nigra, the basal nuclei become overactive. So, poor Michael J. Fox there. Huntington's disease is a dominant genetic disorder in humans. It strikes you in middle age. Huntington's disease is invariably lethal. It can't be weeded out of the population via natural selection because it doesn't affect you until after you've already had kids, typically. So accumulation of mutant huntingtin protein, degeneration of your basal nuclei and cerebral cortex, overstimulation of motor drive. You'll die from it. Spinal cord injuries, really? Okay, paralysis, thoracic region, paraplegia, and your neck, quadriplegic. Above C3, spinal nerves, you're dead because you just shut down your diaphragm.